And what a dummy! Welcome back to the Fantasy Rugby Draft podcast. Thanks for downloading and listening. My name's Bruce Wilkinson, and I'm on my Todd again this week. Mossman couldn't be here with us this afternoon, so apologies that you'll have to put up with my nasally tone, more nasally tone than usual. There's just a lot of fantasy news and notes going about at the moment that we felt we had to at least put something out. Hopefully this will be fairly quick as we go through all the 15 teams and review the fantasy pieces that are associated with each of those teams. You can follow us on Twitter at Fantasy RUG Draft. That's Fantasy RUG Draft. Or drop us a note at support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. Great to get a lot of emails at this time of year, typically with trade offers and what should I do with this player with the bye weeks coming up, and mainly just what's going on in your leagues. There's a lot of interesting trades going on at the moment. I use interesting with inverted commas. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, no, look, keep firing them through. We love to see them. Some fines being dished out in some leagues as well for being last or being unattentive to your teams. We like to hear those. So yeah, fire them through. So as I said, we're going to go through the 15 teams pretty quickly, just with 15 teams. Look at all the different bits for Fantasy Rugby Draft for those teams. I'm going to look at things like the changes to the resting weeks. So we didn't have a podcast last week, but since Chris Boyd made the domination that Beauden Barrett was not going to be rested before the June series, seems that everyone got wind of it, and maybe Chris Boyd was the only one that read the fine print. I'm not too sure, but it seems that everyone followed suit, Mr. Umaga and Mr. Major. So they can do that before the end of this regular season, Super Rugby season now. So that includes the Fantasy Rugby Draft playoffs, which, whilst it might seem like a good thing to get to the playoffs with your Rico Ioane, your Naholos, D-Max, that type of thing, it potentially, well, I certainly saw it as a downside because it means you'll be without those guys in the playoffs. I guess it's your position on your table, whether you're fighting to get that last playoff spot or whether you're actually in the playoffs already and trying to manage those situations. And just on that, so we, if you haven't noticed or you're not keeping a bridge of the fixtures for next game week, there's a massive impact for those that have a lot of South Africans and Jaguares players in your teams. If you wanted to see what the impact is, if you go to your matchup and then just there's a pull down on the right and switch it to your game week 16, and you can certainly see what your starting lineup looks like at the moment anyway. Bereft of all of the players that are going to be on bye. It's the catch-up round for Game Week 1 that they're doing. But yeah, as I say, all South African teams and the Jaguares are missing, so a big chunk of your players. And this game week is the time to do something about it. Next game week, you're either going to be selling 50 cents on the dollar because you're over a barrel and you don't have any collateral. This week, at least, you have some collateral with these South African players, and not just to sell to the folks that are going to the playoffs already and want to stack their team full of bulls. As I mentioned before about the trading, there's some really interesting stuff that's going on in many leagues. There's been talked about ad nauseum. I think a lot of it comes down to subjective views on what you see as collusion, what you see as anti-competitiveness, where a player or a team at least might be out of the playoffs. Are they acting genuinely trying to win, or are they just clocked off and they're just accepting trades willy-nilly? So one of the unintended consequences of actually when we created League Pro and we had the ability to pick your draft order, the ability to select your conference so that there was no weak conference. You could go on last year's league standings and split everybody. And then the last thing was the Sacco. So that's a last place playoff, which literally mirrors the top four. It's the bottom four playoff. Unintended consequence of that was that it keeps everybody pretty honest with trades. So people are still trying to not get that last place position, and they're trying to get into that. If you're in that 7th, 8th spot, trying to get into that 6th or 5th spot so that you don't actually make it into the playoffs. And then if you are in that bottom spot, it keeps you pretty honest because you are trying to tool up to do well at that time, at the same time as the leaders are. So similar type of motivations there. And as we mentioned, a bit of an unintended consequence of League Pro, but it keeps a lot of your managers fairly in line when it comes to officiating on trades, shall we say. But you know your own league, so you need to just come up with a set of rules that works for yourselves. And then kind of go from there. But you can check that out on the site, actually, League Pro. You can still purchase it now. Obviously, the draft order and the conference selection is done, but we dropped the price so that you can still have a Sacco. Now, I guess it's probably most important is to figure out what you actually have as your last place punishment, so that it does act as a little bit of a stick or a carrot, depending on which end of the prism you want to look at, to keep those players honest for trades. Right, let's crack into the teams and the news. So Hurricanes, probably the more significant news is around Matt Proctor, quote unquote, from Hamish Bidwell, as he could be out for a while. So I think the assumption is that we're going to see Geordie into the midfield at some position and Milner Scudder at the back. So we had someone ask us whether we would trade Rieko Ioane for Milner Scudder, and we'd probably do that. Yeah, I think we probably would. In the next, 5 game weeks, the Blues have a bye, and then there's 2 other rest game weeks, so 3 out of the 5 Rico's probably not going to be there, and that's if he doesn't get injured playing for the All Blacks. No, I guess you could probably say that for Milner Scudder, but I expect they're probably not going to have the same amount of exposure, so we say, or game time during that window. So yeah, we probably just go with the bird in hand at this stage. Milner Scudder looked good in pockets. When he's great, he's that silky gliding player that just, he's incredible to watch. Just hasn't quite got up to match fitness yet, but that'll come. And Rieko is Rieko, so we know what you're giving away, but I think you just need to look at minutes that you're going to get out of those players. And whilst Rieko is a superior player, Fantasy Rugby Draft player for Milner Scudder at this point, and there is a big bit of a injury risk with Milner Scudder, we still think it's probably wise to make that trade. So likely to get Wes Hooson back after the break as well, but not sure that really makes too much of a difference. I think what it really does in practice is means that Julian Severe's still got a place on the team, place in the starting lineup, shall we at least say. Blade Thompson, I wouldn't be cutting him straight away. You'll find out what the team is Wednesday afternoon. I wouldn't put him in your waiver wire personally. I would wait just to see if he actually does get the number 8 spot with Evans. I know he came back from injury and it was playing against a team that they were expected to beat by 29 points, according to the New Zealand TAB. However, all that kind of asterisks aside, Blade Thompson was very highly regarded at the start of the season, so there is an outside chance that he may get that 8 spot. So wouldn't just automatically throw him away thinking that Evans and Shields are going to come back in. Well, sorry, I think Shields would, but Evans comes straight back in. Loasi starting to turn into a decent fantasy rugby draft option. Certainly with Fatty Alofa being pulled, I think Fafita's got a bit of a head knock in there as well. I guess we'll see how that kind of shakes out. Old mate who came on, can't remember his name, Douglas or something like that, Murray, came on, went pretty much straight back off. So shortage of really fit locks there at the moment, and Loasi seems to be the number 1 in terms of fitness and being on the paddock. And there's you don't make the club from the tub. And last on the Hurricanes, Ben Lamb is good. That knock on that over the line was a long time coming. Seems to be his modus operandi. That's how he likes to carry the ball. And those things are going to happen. We've seen it many, many times. I remember a Higuare's game where he carried it into the end goal fairly haphazardly as well and put it down fairly late and casually, shall we say, and almost got cleaned up there as well. Right, Reds, really good performance from the Reds. They've obviously just been absolutely rocketed by Thorn, and there was a little bit more seniority in the team coming back, so that's good signs. Jono Lance is an interesting case in point because the Reds have fairly good fixtures coming up, and if you're looking at next week, for instance, and you're looking at players like Dupree, Yankees, Duplessis and Pollard and even Willemse when they come back, they're all missing next week, and then Nick Sanchez as well, so they don't play next week. Players like Lance, Parker, Christian Lealiafano, and almost Jack Depreciani as well comes into that kind of mix, depending on what we think his situation will be. I'm going to get onto the Rebels in a little bit, but back to Jono Lance, good run of fixtures, and it may be that if you need to win in the next 2 game weeks, he's a player that, I kind of say through gritted teeth because he's had problems with injury before, and I guess every player's only one injury away from ending the season, but he seems to be a little bit more made of glass than more. But he is someone that I think that you don't have to concede too much on to give up someone like a Pollard or Yankees, I guess. I don't want to put, and maybe even a Duplessis, but I don't want to put Dupree in that argument because he's someone you probably want to hold on to, and probably the same as Nico Sanchez as well. But I mean, if you have to win the next 2 game weeks and there is nothing on the waiver wire, and you're looking at Orban Ledger next week to fill that spot, you need to think long and hard about whether you actually do that trade this week. To give that extra 1 week to those managers that are either clinching or in the playoffs. As I say, the Reds have got pretty good fixtures coming up as well. Karevi looks much better at 13, but I think we've seen that in the past. Right, let's move on to Sunwolves. So they've got a whole raft of players that are being pulled out of the Sunwolves squad to go to the Japan training session, or training squad of 40 that was announced. So it is going to be a really interesting team sheet this week. Something to be on top of really quickly. They usually come out mid-afternoon on Thursday, so make sure that you've got your finger relatively on the pulse there. Actually, let me say that right now. No, they're playing the Rebels, which is Wednesday night, isn't it? Friday night. So that'll come out on Wednesday afternoon. It's roughly the same time as the Crusaders and the Hurricanes come out. The Rebels and the Sunwolves will put their team out as well. So keep an eye out for that. Players like Emery, check to see, is probably the one player that I've been targeting in a lot of leagues. Everyone else is roughly kind of owned. Players like Salmaki and Little, those are all guys. Parker, they're all fairly well owned in most leagues. It's players like Emery and maybe even Masarewa if he's coming back from injury. Very loath to kind of mention his name after his last outing, but both Salmaki and Masarewa, let's see how their injuries get back. Ride Hayden Parker until you can. They've got the Brumbies next week, which is the week that a lot of the South African teams and the Jaguares are missing. So there's an option to try and bring Parker on board there. And they actually don't have bad fixtures in the playoffs as well. So if you're looking in those kind of, I want to say, I guess the polite term is probably tier 2 fly halves. I had a much more colloquial term of junk fly halves, but they're putting up points at the moment, and Parker will probably keep on doing that as well. Now, it is a little bit of an asterisk to see what that first Sunwolves team looks like before you trade Hayden Parker. Before you sell the farm to get in the playoffs and get Hayden Parker on your team. But certainly a player to target as well with a decent fixture in Gameweek 16 to get you into the playoffs. I don't think the Brave Blossoms 40-man touring squad is going to include Murphy from pulling him out of Game Week 15 and 16. I'd be surprised. We mentioned it before. I'd be very surprised if the Rebels let him leave. And there's no obligation on the Rebels to leave to ask him to go up to Japan or wherever they're training outside of the international window, the World Rugby's international break. So I'd be surprised if they let him, especially considering where they are on the table and who they're playing in these 2 games. When you look at the Blues and the Sunwolves, they look like there could be opportunities to pick up some points. Stormers, we mentioned it on the start bench. There was always going to be an outside chance that Jean-Luc Duplessis was kicking the goals, and not Espiré, and that came about. Certainly thuds them. There was one that hit an upright that almost brought it down, one of his first ones. It wasn't exactly striking them purely, stabbing at them, but that kind of bodes well for him. But the Stormers just seemed to wilt in that heat, and the Sunwolves just kind of came alive. The crowd got behind them, and the rest is yesterday's fish and chip paper. So the Stormers do have 2 bye weeks coming up, so this is really your last chance to get maximum value out of, not maximum, but as much value as you can out of players like Peter Toy, Lades, even SP Murray for those that are battling to try and fill an outside back position. Yeah, look, the tough fixtures as well. If you look at Lions, then it's buy, Jaguares, Sharks, and then buy. So, our recommendation is just sell, sell, sell. Blues, they've got a bye this week as well. You'd have to suggest, if Tana Umaga is actually going to rest his players, the Rieko Ioane and Akira Ioane, that he will do them when he comes back from the bye against the Rebels, and then there's a Reds game in there as well. So whether he does that or not, is up to Tana. He may roll the dice a little bit and say, well, why do we let's leave Rieko at the moment and not rest him for before the internationals, because there's a chance he may actually get injured in the international break. So, and maybe he does that then, but that will come at the cost of having to rest Rieko against New Zealand opposition, which I don't think is what they want to do. So it's a little bit of a roll of the dice with them as well. Managers want to check your waiver wire to make sure that Michael Collins hasn't been picked up, because if he is sitting there, I expect him to come back and be the 15 when after the bye, and they play the Rebels, which is a pretty good matchup as well. Matt Duffy and Nano are probably on the flanks if they don't bench Rieko, and even then it may be that Rieko goes into 13 and you do see a Duffy, Nano, Collins back three. Crusaders, Crotty again, frustrating, head knock. It's a bit of an interesting one. There was a really interesting article that came out around that, and it was almost implying that a percentages of players actually do get knocked out and they fail the HOA because of that. And then there is another percentage of it is that they just can't think straight because they're so G'd up. There's so much endorphins running around. There's adrenaline running around everywhere. And it's a very, very complicated HIA test and puzzle that they have to go through. And he suggests that, and they are tailored to each individual. So, some of these have got Mensa brains, some of them do not. And so the HIA test is tailored to each individual and their level. However, it's tricky, and players do just fail it even if they haven't had an HIA. So yeah, it's an interesting new science that they're going to try and get into as well. With I think there's going to be a spit test at some stage. I think that's the last thing I saw. Anyway, a long way about saying no Ryan Crotty. Probably Tim Bateman just slots in there fairly easy enough with Jack Goodhue. Matalei's out with a hamstring injury, but the Crusaders do actually have a fairly tough run in the next three anyway. So it's Hurricanes, Chiefs, and then the bye after that in semi-final week 1. So it depends if you want to look at the semi-final week 1 and say I don't want any of my team to be on a bye and I want to maximise it, or whether you just ride that out, because I think they play the Highlanders and the Blues in the semi-final week 2 and the final. So whilst it's not overseas international, it's probably the two teams that you will score more points against, but still very tough in New Zealand derby. I believe Dag is back. I'm not sure how much game time he will get and where he'll fit in. He didn't exactly come back with a hiss and a roar last time. Questions. Actually, we had a really interesting debate this morning around, someone who's already in the playoffs. Would you trade Jack Goodhue for Jesse Creel, and maybe even Walter Little's son, Michael Little? There is a good case to be made for it. Looking at those fixtures, looking at missing semi-final week 1, Jesse Creel's in the form of his life. Plays the Sunwolves in semi-final week 1, and a little bit easier in 2 in the final. A little bit harder, shall we say, in week 2 in the final. But still, nonetheless, you don't miss out, and Jesse is playing well. So, yeah, you need to start looking at those types of opportunities. The idea is it's not necessarily to rip someone off in a trade, but it's to offer them something. You offer the Jack Goodhue to managers that need to win now, and that have players like Hellant or Jesse Creel or someone like that who's got decent fixtures and playing well in the playoffs. Waratahs. This is probably the last week to try and get players on the Waratahs because they have a tough matchup away from home at the Chiefs. So looking at the front row, Naivoro, I see that's come into parlance a lot more. Happened again in the weekend, brilliant. Naiyaravoro. Foley and Flower are going to be a tough sell to try and get them on your team, certainly after the points that they just put up. But if you can, great. And maybe just highlight the way that they got the Chiefs this week. Tough matchup. Curtis Rona, I keep saying it. I would expect him to be starting in that 13 and continually doing it, and he may be on a lot of people's benches and not actually realising any of the value sitting on the bench, certainly with the managers that have only got a couple of game weeks left anyway. Highlanders, looks like Nabura's probably going to go on a holiday, early shower for him, which is good news for Jet Li, so he's likely to come in for him. The concern, I guess, around what we talked about at the top with the Highlanders and everybody changing the views on when they should rest their All Blacks is that players like Naholo could potentially have a little bit of a hole in your fantasy playoffs, which would be pretty devastating. The Highlanders have the Brumbies in semi-final week 2 and the I think it's the Rebels in the final. So, yeah, there is a concern there. You'd much prefer it to see the damage happen pre-season, pre the finals. We'll just take a little bit of a sidebar here and run through Manager Pro 4 in form. Go to www.fantasyrugbydraft.com/Manager Pro, where winning is everything. Actually, before I get into the 4 in form, which is an interesting case this week, a few stats from the Aviva Premiership and Manager Pro users. 63% of Manager Pro users made the playoffs, which is a huge figure, and 37% of them won a title. So, just some interesting stats that I'm sure most managers with Manager Pro already aren't particularly surprised about. But yeah, so the top players in form. Probably could guess the top one, Hayden Parker and his drop goal. He's at 40.4. Sharks front row are on an absolute tear at the moment. Aka van der Merwe, Thomas Tutoy and the Beast just showing pop passes and shimmies everywhere. We'll get onto the Sharks in a little bit. Jose Salmaki, 32.3, and Nico Sanchez, 31.7. Interesting name in 5th, actually, so Delgi as well. So, yeah, some really interesting players there on your pro that those guys are obviously going to all be owned. But if you just look at your free agents and then look at your pro, it makes all the world of difference to figure out actually who is playing well. Really, really useful stuff. Sharks, front row, we just talked about then. They do miss next week, and it is something that I wanted to bring up with Mossman when he was on the podcast last time, because he mentioned that the Sharks, I think it was the Highlanders, played fairly well against front rows, and I just think the Sharks is one of those matchups at the moment. The Sharks front row is someone that you just can't bench. There isn't a matchup that I would be scared of, and you'd look at this Higuaru's one, and that's probably the one that's going to be the most tricky coming in. They're playing immensely well at the moment. Really, really impressed with the Higuarus. But that said, I still think the hairy warthog will get his done, and the Beast and Thomas Tutoy will still pick up all those offloads. I still think there's opportunity there, and as I say, I'm not benching a Sharks front row for anyone. Interesting sub with Bosch at 41 minutes. I didn't actually pick up if that was an injury. Apologies. I'm sure you guys all your Bosch owners are aware exactly what is happening there with him, but yeah, a little bit earlier on than I would have expected with him. The Chiefs, so maybe a really interesting point as well with this one to see if DMAC comes back or not. I know that they said that they can rest players after the international, and maybe that's the way Cooper does go, and that is in semi-final week 2 with the Brumbies is probably the likely one that they will rest him for. If you kind of believe the mantra that you're not really going to rest your All Blacks for New Zealand derbies. But the other one that they potentially could do that is a New Zealand derby is only this week, so the Waratahs at home. So we shall see. But just Marty McKenzie was okay. Just another guy though. Got you 10 points, which I think was near his season high. I think he might have got 10 or 11 somewhere else as well. That losing bonus point, I think, just by the buys could come in quite useful a little bit later. Shooter Stevenson was a bit disappointing. I think there'll be more to come from him. The Sharks are a good team, and at the end of a tour as well, in a Chiefs team that won't really resemble what a Chiefs team will look like for the rest of the season as well. The Lions, this is a really interesting run, right? Because none of their backs produced. They were pretty disappointing all round. Like, there was some real... our eyes lit up with the Brumbies going over there, looking at players like Tumboy, Diante, Van Rensburg, even Mahuza and Kutsia, and these guys all performed a lot lower than they should have. Away for the Stormers, who would have got a kick, it's a tough matchup as well, so I'm not sure you're going to do anything with too much with those particular players that I listed. We're going to likely to see Vorster and Mapost somewhere back in the mix. It didn't sound like their injuries were too serious when Swiss was talking about it. If you haven't checked your waiver wire for Ross Cronje, please do that as well. I know they miss next week, and then also I think they actually miss semi-final week 2 as well, if I remember rightly. The Lions do, so it's something to have a look at, but he is a player that's a difference maker in terms of halfbacks. Brumbies, the Thomas Banks trolling us. He might actually be okay in the next 2. If you look at this match, and then they've got the Sunwolves at home in Gameweek 16, so they are someone that may get you in the playoffs. So, looking at average South African outside backs that I might want, for 2 game weeks to get me in the playoffs. I might want to get rid of is Lades. I would do a Banks for Lades trade, which is pretty low rent all round, but it still gives you that extra game week, and it is against the Sunwolves. Tough for Valentini. It looked a bad injury for him. I guess we'll know when the team gets named the extent of the injury, but knee injury game for him, so tough break for the kid. Higuares, really, really impressive performance. They are humming at the moment. That team isn't just grinding out when they got home. They are putting together some really good phase play. Looks like there's a cookie cutter for wingers in Higuares in Argentina. These are huge, like Montero and Mofford. They're Cordero, Delgui, or Cancellieri. The little kind of jinky guys, swift on their feet, got a good step on them, and get involved a lot. But it's really going to be interesting to see what comes out of Moyano coming back from injury, mainly because I believe that they consider Moyano to be their number 1 right winger, and Delgui was playing there as well, and it looked like the ranking of just wingers without looking at positions was Buffelli, Moyano, Delgui, and then Cancellieri, but I'm not 100% convinced I'm not 100% sure, whether Delgui can play on the left wing. So quite what happens, and whether, that was a long way about saying, is Cancellieri valuable for a pickup this week? I think he's worth it, just to check. I wouldn't sell the farm in terms of cutting players that may provide you value in the playoffs, but because of that little bit of unknown. But I think with the way the Higuares are playing at the moment, it's really impressive. Buffelli, we had one sample size of him playing the Brumbies at fullback, which was really poor, and kind of put the brakes on us, fully pushing our chips in and recommending him as a play at 15. We've now seen one at 15, so you can pretty much shelve any concerns that he is going to be that different player. He looked really, really good at 15, and he wasn't just that long boot that we saw for the first game against the Brumbies. He was getting involved a lot, linking play, really, really impressive for him, scored a try as well. So long may it continue for him. But here's another good example for someone that you might trade for, to give up a New Zealand player that's, say so, in that kind of middle range. If the Buffelli manager hasn't made the playoffs, they'll miss him next week. So you're in that kind of grey area where you need to get value and you need to win to get into your playoffs, but you don't want to completely hamstring yourself. You need to figure out what you get back. Kramer, another player that a lot of managers have been backwards and forwards on in terms of a lock playing out of position. But as long as the Higuera's form continues as it is, then our recommendation is that he's a good fit for your team at lock. Bulls, that was a pretty tough matchup for them. I think their stud still performed with looking at Creel and Hallant, and I am probably trying to get those two in a number of my trades if I've made the playoffs. And it is just a matter of what you give up. We talked about players like Goodhue, a couple of those Crusaders players might be interesting. I'm not sure you could give up a setter, but they're at least they're playing in the next 2 game weeks, and Hallant isn't next week. So yeah, something like that is trying to find someone who is in a bit of a bind and offering something that works for both. Berger Odendahl looks to be back this week, which means Pollard will go back to 10. Should be a good matchup with the Brumbies. Shorn of a couple of their big boys up front. Very impressive performance from the Brumbies last week against the Lions. I'm not too sure which way to value that, whether that's a Lions performance that a little bit disjointed, or whether this is the Brumbies that have kind of realising their strengths and getting a lot of the players like Pocock and Nasarani back and playing well. Leali'ifano switching back into 10 makes quite a big difference. Certainly made a big difference to this game. The balance just seems to be a bit better with him there. Rebels, Sunwolves this week again. So you look at players like Tupou, who came in last week. I hope you've held on to him, just in the view that he may be playing this weekend as well. And let's see what the Sunwolves team looks like. One concern with the Rebels, I guess, is Jack Deprashini and what you're going to do with him. He lost the kicking duties and he lost his fly half position, but we're not too sure if that was just because of injury or change, and whether this is going to be an actual change moving forward, or whether they're going to be happy with Jack, because Hodge at 10 against the Brumbies gave them a little bit of impetus and strike. Jack Maddox is also in the mix there as well. They swapped around a little bit. So he does have good fixtures, and he is in that kind of bottom tier of your Lances, Parkers, Leali'ifanos, to look at if you're in a fly half bind for next week. But there is a bit of upside there as well if he does actually stay at 10, and he's going to be kicking the goals against the Sunwolves and against the Blues. So yeah, two decent matchups you would have thought there. That's probably about as much as you want to listen to my nasal voice. Again, apologies for the one-man show. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson. Come to your repeat.
What a bust here by Christian Cullen. Plenty of support, and what a